Have you ever heard of a woman so dangerous that even Rome's most ruthless emperors whispered her name with fear? A woman whose beauty was a weapon, and whose love could mean your death by morning. Yes, this story is exactly what the title promised. Because tonight, you'll step inside the secret life of Agrippina the Younger, the Shadow Queen of Rome. She wasn't just the mother of Nero, she was the puppeteer who controlled the empire from behind silk curtains. But how far did she go? How did she use seduction, manipulation, and blood to build her empire of pleasure and power? That's the secret we'll uncover, and trust me, what you'll learn in the next few minutes will change how you see Roman history forever. Picture Rome, marble streets glowing under torchlight, the scent of wine and rose oil floating through the air. Behind the polished columns of the Palatine Hill, power was traded not in coins, but in bodies. And in this world of whispers and betrayals, a young girl named Agrippina learned one lesson early: that survival in Rome didn't depend on strength, it depended on control. She was born into a family cursed by ambition, the bloodline of Augustus himself. Her father, Germanicus, was adored by the people. Her mother, Agrippina the Elder, was fierce and proud. But when Germanicus mysteriously died, her mother accused the emperor of murder, and soon the entire family was destroyed. Her brothers were executed. Her mother was exiled. And little Agrippina, still a teenager, was left to survive in the most dangerous court in the world. Imagine being 15 and realizing that kindness could get you killed. So she learned the art of silence, of watching, of waiting. While other girls dreamed of marriage, Agrippina studied the desires of men, their fears, their weaknesses, their secrets. By 17, she was married to a man twice her age, the dull but wealthy Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus. He was cruel, arrogant, and unfaithful, but Agrippina wasn't interested in love. She wanted a son, a weapon she could one day use. And that son was Nero, but destiny in Rome was never kind. When the Emperor Caligula, her own brother, rose to power, Agrippina's beauty and ambition drew his attention. Whispers spread through the palace, whispers of forbidden affection. Rumors so dark that even senators avoided speaking them aloud. Was Agrippina manipulating her own brother, or was Caligula obsessed with her? No one knew for sure. But what we do know is that her charm and cunning earned her both power and exile. She was banished to a lonely island in the Tyrrhenian Sea, her possessions stripped, her allies gone, her reputation shattered. But Agrippina wasn't the kind of woman to fade into the background. While the waves crashed against the rocks, she planned her return. She knew Caligula's reign wouldn't last, and she was right. When he was assassinated, Rome plunged into chaos. And from that chaos, a new emperor rose, her uncle, Claudius. And that's when the shadows began to move again, because Agrippina saw in Claudius not family, but opportunity. Most people would see an uncle, she saw a throne. Most people would see boundaries, she saw doors waiting to be opened. And in the next chapter of her life, she would walk through those doors dressed not as a victim of exile, but as a queen reborn. Because the empire of pleasure was just beginning to take shape, and Agrippina was about to rewrite the rules of desire, power, and betrayal in Rome. When Agrippina returned from exile, Rome barely recognized her. The fragile, disgraced girl of the past was gone. In her place stood a woman carved from ambition and steel. She had learned how fragile power was in Rome. One day, you're the emperor's sister. The next, you're nothing more than a name whispered in fear. So this time she wouldn't just chase power, she would become it. The year was 49 AD. Emperor Claudius, her uncle, ruled Rome, a man brilliant in mind but weak in spirit. He was kind, easily influenced, and surrounded by schemers. Perfect prey for Agrippina's charm. But before she could reach him, she had to eliminate one woman standing in her way: Messalina, Claudius's wife. Messalina was known for her beauty and her scandals. Whispers of her secret lovers filled every Roman bathhouse. So when Agrippina learned that Messalina had betrayed Claudius, not just with passion, but with a fake marriage to another man, she saw her chance. She didn't raise a sword. She didn't need to. She simply guided the emperor's rage in the right direction. Messalina was executed, and within months, Agrippina became the most powerful woman in Rome. But her next move shocked the empire. Because Agrippina wanted more than influence, she wanted legitimacy. And the only way to get it was to marry Claudius himself. The problem, he was her uncle. Rome gasped at the idea. It was unthinkable. But Agrippina smiled and made it sound noble. She convinced the Senate that their marriage was an act of divine destiny, that together they would restore the Julian bloodline. Claudius, caught between awe and desire, agreed. And so, amid incense and gold, the forbidden wedding took place. For the first time in Roman history, an emperor married his niece. From that moment, Agrippina became the empire's hidden ruler. Every decree that Claudius signed, she influenced. Every senator who approached him, she vetted. Even the guards at the palace gates knew. Nothing happened without her approval. But her most brilliant move wasn't in the Senate, it was in the nursery. She persuaded Claudius to adopt her son, Nero, making him the rightful heir over Claudius's biological son, Britannicus. And just like that, the game was set. The boy who was once a pawn would soon wear the crown. Agrippina's rule was not loud. She didn't shout orders or wave swords. She ruled through silence, through glances that could freeze the most seasoned general. People called her Augusta, the Empress, but behind closed doors, they called her the Shadow Queen. She created her own imperial court, filled with poets, scholars, and advisors who owed her everything. Even the coinage of Rome bore her face beside the emperor's, something no woman had ever achieved before. But Rome was a city of envy, and the whispers began again. Was she truly ruling for the good of the empire or for herself? Some said she poisoned those who opposed her. Others claimed she seduced men of power to bind them to her cause. And Claudius himself began to sense the danger sleeping beside him. One night as the emperor dined, he looked into his cup of wine and wondered, was his queen truly his ally or his doom? But by then, it was too late. Agrippina had already sealed her legacy and his fate, because Claudius was falling ill. And soon, whispers in the palace corridors spoke of mushrooms, sweet, tender, deadly. Was it chance? Or was it her? History never confirmed it, but Rome already knew the answer. When Claudius took his last breath, Agrippina stood beside the throne, calm, composed, and ready. And as the people mourned their emperor, she quietly guided her son, Nero, to the seat of power. The girl who was once exiled had become the most powerful woman in Rome. She had no army, no legions, no sword, only her mind and her charm. But power in Rome was never eternal, because even as Nero rose to rule, Agrippina began to realize that creating a monster is one thing, but controlling him would be another story entirely. In the early days of Nero's reign, Agrippina was unstoppable. Every decree bore her approval. Every messenger passed through her chambers first. Her portrait stood beside Nero's on coins, and she sat beside him in the Senate, something no woman had ever dared before. She would whisper in his ear, and he would nod like a loyal son. But behind that motherly smile there was control. Every move, every alliance, every whisper of rebellion, Agrippina handled it. Rome didn't have one ruler, it had two. At first, Nero adored her. He had been raised to worship his mother's strength. But as he grew older, that devotion began to twist. Because Agrippina wasn't just powerful, she was possessive. She chose who he could trust, who he could love, and who could even look at him. When Nero's affection began to drift toward a woman named Acte, a former slave who captured his heart, Agrippina's fury was volcanic. She saw Acte as a threat, not just to her control, but to her identity. In her mind, she wasn't just Nero's mother, she was Rome's queen. Whispers began to spread across the city that Agrippina's control over her son went beyond maternal love, that her obsession had crossed boundaries no one dared name. The lines between power and intimacy blurred, and Nero began to feel suffocated in his own palace. The mother who once lifted him to the throne was now a storm cloud hanging over his every move. He began to rebel in quiet ways, signing decrees without her approval, meeting senators in secret, and most dangerously, surrounding himself with people she despised. Agrippina could sense it, her power was slipping. But she wouldn't let it go quietly. In one chilling night, she appeared uninvited at a royal feast dressed in shimmering gold, her presence commanding silence. She sat across from Nero and his allies, and every glance she gave was a dagger cloaked in a smile. That night, Rome understood one thing: this wasn't a mother and son. This was war between two emperors. Agrippina tried everything to pull him back: guilt, affection, flattery. She reminded Nero how she had fought to make him emperor, how she had destroyed anyone who dared to oppose him. But Nero was no longer the trembling boy at her side. He was discovering his own dark pleasures, the thrill of independence, the taste of power unchained. And soon he began to plot her downfall. Still, Agrippina wasn't blind. She could sense his distance, the way he flinched at her touch, the way his guards avoided her eyes. But she underestimated one thing: how far Nero would go to break free from her shadow. One night, as she stood by the sea at her villa in Baiae, Agrippina looked out at the dark waves. She whispered to a servant, "I made him emperor, and I can unmake him too." Those words would seal her fate, because Nero, her own flesh and blood, had already decided that the only way to rule Rome was to destroy the woman who had created him. In the end, it was never just about politics or control. It was about the most dangerous love story in Roman history, the love between a mother and a son, twisted by power, pride, and paranoia. The decision wasn't made in one night. It crept up on him, whispered by his advisors, fueled by the echoes of her voice haunting every corridor. "How long," they asked him, "will the empire be ruled by a woman's shadow?" Nero didn't answer. But inside, he knew they were right. Every command he gave felt borrowed, every victory claimed in her name. And deep inside that fragile ego, something snapped. He didn't want freedom anymore. He wanted revenge. At first, he tried to do it the honorable way, if such a word could even exist in Rome. He planned a gift for his mother, a magnificent ship, glittering with gold and silk, a vessel fit for the woman who gave Rome its emperor. Agrippina accepted it with her usual grace, though her eyes, sharp as daggers, seemed to search his face for the truth. And that night, under the moonlight of Baiae's calm bay, the ship sailed and sank. It was no accident. The bolts had been loosened, the hull weakened, a beautiful coffin disguised as a gift. But destiny wasn't done with Agrippina just yet. She survived. Bruised, drenched in seawater, her handmaidens gone, her body battered, but her spirit unbroken. She swam through the dark water, dragging herself toward the shore like a ghost rising from the underworld. Imagine that moment. Nero waiting in his palace, a messenger running through the halls, and the words that turned his blood cold. "She lives." Agrippina had returned, and Rome trembled. Some say she laughed when she heard that Nero had tried to kill her. Others claim she sent him a simple message: if the emperor wishes his mother dead, he must finish the job himself. Can you feel that chill? Because that's the moment Rome crossed the line between myth and madness. It was late when Nero's soldiers arrived at her villa. The torches glowed through the mist, and the waves crashed softly against the shore. Agrippina knew why they had come. She didn't scream, she didn't plead. She simply stood there, a woman who had ruled emperors, a mother betrayed by the son she had created. And when the assassin hesitated, Agrippina, in her final act of defiance, touched her chest and whispered, "Strike here, where the son of Agrippina was born." And he did. The woman who had ruled Rome without a crown fell in silence, her blood mixing with the sea breeze. When news spread across the empire, Rome didn't cheer. It didn't mourn either. It whispered. Because every senator, every servant, every soldier knew, if a son could kill his own mother for power, then nothing was sacred anymore. Nero had freed himself from her shadow, yes, but in doing so, he had cursed himself. In the end, Agrippina's death wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of Nero's downfall. The woman he killed would become his ghost. Every time he heard the sea, he would remember her eyes. Every time thunder struck Rome, he would hear her voice whispering through the rain. And history, it never forgot, because Agrippina wasn't just the Empress of Rome, she was the empire's mirror, a reflection of what happens when ambition devours love, and when power demands the ultimate sacrifice. They thought killing Agrippina would end her story, but in Rome, death was never an ending, it was only the beginning of myth. The morning after her death, the sea outside Bay was calm. Too calm. Fishermen whispered that the water refused to move, as if the gods themselves were holding their breath. And inside Nero's palace, the silence was louder than screams. At first, people didn't believe it. How could Nero, Rome's young emperor, murder his own mother? The official statement was neat, almost poetic. Agrippina, the empress mother, had conspired against her son and met a traitor's fate. But Rome was a city built on rumor. And rumors, like smoke, always find a way out. Soon the whispers began that her body had been burned secretly, that her eyes were still open when the flames took her, and that Nero, standing at a distance, couldn't stop trembling when the first spark touched her robes. Every senator who had once bowed before her now avoided even saying her name. It wasn't just fear, it was guilt, because everyone had watched her rise, everyone had needed her power, and now no one wanted to remember. But Nero remembered. He couldn't forget. They say he started waking up at night, sweating, shaking, the echoes of a woman's voice calling his name from somewhere beyond the marble walls. At first he thought it was imagination, the price of too much wine and too little sleep. But then the servants began to whisper. Doors would slam on their own. Footsteps echoed in empty corridors. And sometimes, in the stillness before dawn, they swore they heard the sea lapping at the palace floors. Agrippina had ruled Rome once. Now she ruled Nero's nightmares. And perhaps that was her final victory. In ancient Rome, death didn't erase people, it transformed them. They became symbols, tools for poets, weapons for politics. Soon, stories of Agrippina began spreading through taverns and temples alike. To some, she was a tragic heroine, a woman too strong for the fragile men around her. To others, she was a monster, a mother who wielded her son's crown like a dagger. And just like that, the legend of the Shadow Queen was born. Plays were written in secret describing her last night. Poets painted her death as both horrifying and beautiful, a warning to every woman who dared to wield power. Because in Rome, power was a man's game, and Agrippina had played it better than anyone. Months passed, but her presence lingered. At public festivals, statues of her were quietly removed. At temples, her name was scratched from the marble. It was as if Nero was trying to erase her, to rewrite history itself. But no matter how hard he tried, she remained everywhere. The markets still echoed with her decrees. The women of Rome still spoke her name in whispers, some with fear, others with awe. And in the palaces of her rivals, people began to notice something strange. Those who had rejoiced at her death met their own ends soon after by poison, by exile, by betrayal. It was as if the empress was taking them, one by one. And here's the truth most people forget: Agrippina may have died by the sword, but her story became immortal. You see, real power doesn't end when your heart stops beating. Real power begins when your name refuses to die. Every time someone whispered her name in fear, every time Nero trembled in his sleep, every time a Roman woman looked at her reflection and thought, "I could be more than they allow me to be," Agrippina lived again. That was her revenge, not blood, not death, but memory. Because history may favor the victors, but it never forgets the women who dared to rule them. The fire that was meant to consume Agrippina's body didn't just burn her flesh. It ignited a myth, and that myth spread faster than any soldier, faster than any decree Nero could issue. Even in death, Agrippina was everywhere. Months after her execution, the empire began to change in subtle, eerie ways. Artists painted women with her sharp eyes and proud jawline. Poets spoke of the mother of emperors who ruled even from the grave. And in dark corners of Rome's taverns, where wine flowed and tongues loosened, men whispered that her ghost appeared by the sea, her face half hidden beneath a black veil, her voice soft but commanding. "Tell my story before they erase me." It wasn't just superstition, it was defiance. Because Agrippina represented something far more dangerous than rebellion. She represented memory, and memory is something no empire can control. As Nero's madness deepened, the shadow of Agrippina grew heavier over him. He built grand palaces, filled them with dancers, gold, and wine, but the music always seemed to echo her voice. They say he would pause mid-performance, staring into the dark seats as if expecting her to be there, watching, judging. His friends began to fear him, not because of his cruelty, they'd seen worse, but because he'd begun to talk to someone no one else could see. When thunder cracked over Rome, Nero would look up and whisper, "I hear you, mother." It wasn't long before he became obsessed with omens. A bird flying the wrong way, a mirror breaking, a shadow moving where none should be. Agrippina wasn't gone, she was in his mind, in his heart, woven into the very walls of his empire. And every decision he made after her death was a battle between guilt and fear. Outside the palace, Rome was spinning a tale of its own. They called her the Dark Queen of Rome. Some said she was born under a cursed star. Others swore she was blessed by the goddess Juno herself, a divine mother, betrayed by her own blood. Street performers turned her life into tragedy plays. In dimly lit theaters, actresses in golden robes reenacted her final night, the betrayal, the dagger, the sea. Every time the scene played, the crowd went silent at the same moment. When Agrippina looked at her son and whispered, "Strike here in the womb that bore you." And that line echoed through generations. It wasn't just drama, it was prophecy. A warning that Rome could destroy even its most powerful women but never truly silence them. By the time Nero's rule started collapsing, Rome had turned into a city haunted by ghosts, not just Agrippina's, but every soul she'd crushed, every lover she'd ruined, every rival who'd fallen before her throne. But hers was the loudest voice. When the great fire of Rome tore through the city, some swore they saw her shape in the smoke, a tall, regal figure watching the flames with cold satisfaction. Her revenge, they said, had come. And when Nero finally fell, hunted, humiliated, and alone, he was heard muttering a single line before his death: "She will never forgive me." He was right, because even centuries later, her spirit clung to the empire's memory like ivy to stone. Historians tried to erase her name. Chroniclers softened her image, turning her from ruler to temptress, from strategist to sinner. But others, quietly, preserved the truth. In hidden scrolls and forbidden texts, they wrote of Agrippina as a woman of impossible ambition, a queen who played a man's game, and almost won. They said she understood the empire better than any general, that she used beauty as a weapon, charm as a shield, and power as a prayer. And those same writers, centuries later, inspired the storytellers of the Renaissance, who painted her as the ultimate forbidden figure, a woman punished not for sin but for power. So here's the twist no one saw coming. Agrippina's story isn't just about lust, murder, or betrayal. It's about control. Every empire fears the same thing, a woman who refuses to play her role quietly. Agrippina didn't just mother an emperor, she tried to rule him. And when he killed her, he proved her right, that his empire was built not on strength but on insecurity. Her death became the foundation of her legend, because centuries later her name is still spoken, her ambition still debated, her story still retold. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what she wanted. Not love, not redemption, but immortality. The sea still remembers her. The stones of Bay still whisper her name. And in every tale of power, beauty, and downfall that followed, you'll always find a shadow that looks a lot like Agrippina. Because history doesn't bury women like her. It hides them, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover the truth again. Darkness, the sound of waves. A moonlit sea washing over ancient ruins, silent except for whispers carried on the wind. And if you listen closely, you can still hear her name. Agrippina, the queen who refused to stay dead, the mother who haunted emperors. The woman Rome tried to forget but couldn't, because in the centuries after her death her story didn't fade. It transformed. Rome fell, kingdoms rose, and time buried marble under dust, but somewhere, deep in the human heart, Agrippina's story survived. At first, she lived through rumor. Old fishermen near Baiae claimed that on stormy nights, a glowing figure walked the shore where her villa once stood. They said she was searching for her crown or for her son. No one dared to ask. Priests called it blasphemy, but poets called it poetry. And slowly her ghost became more than a haunting. It became a symbol of power unbroken and of vengeance deferred. By the 2nd century, whispers turned into worship. In quiet, candle-lit rooms hidden beneath Roman villas, small groups of women gathered to honor her name. They weren't praying to a goddess. They were paying respect to a woman who had defied gods and men alike. They wore red robes, the color of blood and rebirth. They lit lamps in circles, each flame representing a truth Rome had buried. Their chant was simple: "She who was silenced will speak again." And maybe in those shadows they believed Agrippina did hear them, that somewhere beyond life and death, her spirit smiled at their defiance. As centuries passed, history's storytellers began to change her image. Medieval monks painted her as a monster, a seductress who brought ruin to her house. But Renaissance thinkers, centuries later, saw something else. They saw intelligence. They saw strategy. They saw a woman who refused to let history write her as a victim. Artists painted her rising from the sea, not as a ghost, but as a goddess reborn. In one painting, she holds a serpent in one hand and a crown in the other, as if declaring, "I will not be defined by your fear." And that right there is when Agrippina the woman became Agrippina the idea. Empires fall, languages die, but ideas, they evolve. Agrippina's idea was dangerous, especially to men who ruled through fear. She represented the forbidden thought that women could be powerful without permission, that they could command loyalty, inspire terror, and shape history, not as lovers or mothers, but as rulers. In the salons of Renaissance Italy, philosophers debated her. Was she evil or merely misunderstood? Did she crave power, or simply what the world denied her? And the more they argued, the more immortal she became.